My name is Mia Wallace. I'm 34 years old, and for most of my professional life, I've been the person people describe with words like reliable, steady, or my personal favorite, quiet but capable. I work in corporate compliance for a mid-sized financial services firm. Not glamorous, not dramatic, mostly spreadsheets, documentation trails, regulatory updates, and emails nobody reads until they have to. I live alone in a modest apartment just outside the city center. I pay my bills on time. I answer messages promptly. I rarely raise my voice. People assume that means I don't have one. At work, I'm the one who remembers policy revisions from 3 years ago, the one who catches small inconsistencies in quarterly reports, the one who stays late during audit season without announcing it to the room. My manager used to introduce me as our documentation wizard, usually followed by a small laugh as if what I did was helpful, but not powerful. There's something interesting about being underestimated. It's not loud. It's not cruel in obvious ways. It's subtle. It's the way your suggestions are rephrased by someone else and suddenly taken seriously. It's how decisions are made in meetings you weren't invited to, even though you'll be responsible for explaining them later. For a long time, I told myself it didn't matter. I believed competence would speak for itself. I believed integrity would eventually be obvious. I believed that if I just kept doing the work properly, recognition would arrive quietly the way I did everything else. This story isn't about revenge. It isn't about humiliation. And it certainly isn't about destroying anyone. It's about a moment. A moment when my manager blamed me for an audit failure. A moment when an external auditor looked up from the report and said, "Can I see your notes?" And a moment when my documentation, the kind everyone joked about, exposed exactly who had been skipping compliance checks for months. But what changed me wasn't the blame. It wasn't even the exposure. It was realizing that silence can be either surrender or strategy. Over the next hour, I'm going to tell you how I went from invisible support staff to the quiet center of a professional reckoning. Not through shouting, not through confrontation, but through patience, documentation, and one irreversible decision. If you've ever been the person who did everything right and still ended up holding the blame, you might understand this story more than you expect. Have you ever stayed quiet in a room and later realized that your silence was being mistaken for weakness? In the office, I existed in the margins of other people's confidence. That's not self-pity. It's just geography. If you walked into one of our Monday morning meetings, you would see Daniel, my manager, standing near the screen, sleeves rolled up, projecting energy. You would hear Olivia from operations speaking quickly, confidently, as if speed itself proved competence. You would notice the sales directors nodding at one another in agreement before anyone had finished a sentence. You probably wouldn't notice me. I usually sat 2 seats from the end of the table, laptop open, black leather notebook beside it, while others spoke in summaries. I listened in specifics. When someone said, "Compliance signed off on that," I would quietly scroll through the policy update to confirm whether we actually had. Most of the time, we hadn't. But correcting people in real time creates friction. And friction, in corporate environments, is often mistaken for negativity. So instead of interrupting, I would say things like, "I'll double check that after the meeting," or "I'll circulate the updated guidance." That became my role. The double checker, the circulator, the cleaner of loose ends. Daniel liked to say I was detail-oriented to a fault. He meant it as a compliment. I'm sure he did. But it was always delivered with a tone that suggested my precision was excessive, as if caution were an inconvenience to momentum. In performance reviews, I was described as consistent and dependable, never strategic, never leadership material. My work prevented regulatory penalties. My reports passed inspections. My audit preparation materials were used as templates for other teams. But when recognition came, it flowed upward. I remember once preparing a full internal risk assessment ahead of a minor regulatory review. I had flagged 3 potential exposure points, including one in transaction reporting that hadn't yet been escalated. I sent the memo to Daniel. 2 days later, he presented his proactive risk mitigation strategy to the executive team. He thanked me for supporting data. That was the word, supporting. It's strange how language shapes perception. Supporting implies secondary, auxiliary, replaceable. Over time, I began to understand something subtle. I wasn't being dismissed because I lacked value. I was being contained because my value was inconvenient. Documentation creates accountability. Accountability makes people uncomfortable. So I was safe as long as I stayed quiet, accurate, and slightly underestimated. And I did stay quiet. Not because I was afraid, but because I believed competence accumulates interest. I believed that integrity compounds. I believed that when something serious happened, something that required evidence rather than charisma, the scales would naturally rebalance. I didn't know how literal that belief would become. At the time, I thought I was simply the quiet one in the room. I didn't yet understand that invisibility can be both a cage and a shield. The first time I realized something was wrong, it wasn't dramatic. No raised voices, no accusation, just a sentence. It happened on a Thursday afternoon during our quarterly compliance checkpoint meeting. The atmosphere was casual, coffee cups half finished, laptops open, people already mentally stepping into the weekend. We were reviewing transaction monitoring procedures ahead of an upcoming internal review. I had flagged a gap in our reconciliation process the week before. Specifically, a set of high-value transfers that weren't receiving secondary sign-off under the updated compliance framework. It wasn't catastrophic, but it was real. I documented it. I emailed Daniel. I attached screenshots. During the meeting, Olivia mentioned the reconciliation workflow in passing. Daniel nodded and said, "Yes, that's been reviewed. Compliance cleared it." The room moved on. I felt a small shift in my chest. I waited a beat, then said calmly, "Just to clarify, this secondary sign-off control hasn't been implemented yet. I flagged it last week." There was a brief silence. Not hostile, just inconvenient. Daniel didn't look at me right away. He scrolled through his phone, then said lightly, "Right, but it's minor. We'll adjust it before the audit." Minor, the word landed harder than I expected, because compliance doesn't operate on minors. It operates on documented or undocumented, implemented or not implemented, present or absent. I didn't argue. I simply said, "Okay, I'll follow up with the timeline." The meeting continued. No one referenced it again. Afterward, Daniel stopped by my desk. "You're technically right," he said, leaning slightly against the partition. "But sometimes we don't need to elevate every small procedural gap. It makes us look disorganized." I remember that sentence precisely, not because it was cruel, but because it reframed accuracy as disruption. I nodded, understood, and I meant it. I understood that optics were being prioritized over process. I understood that speed mattered more than safeguards, at least until something went wrong. I understood that pointing out vulnerabilities in real time made leadership uncomfortable. What I didn't say was this: audits don't evaluate intentions, they evaluate records. That afternoon, I updated my notebook. Date, topic, exact wording used in the meeting. Status of control implementation, manager acknowledgement. Not because I was preparing for conflict, but because something inside me registered the pattern. It was the first small cut, the first moment where I realized truth could be softened into a narrative if no one insisted on precision. And I had always been precise. From that day forward, I began documenting not just policies, but conversations. Not in a dramatic way, not secretly recording anything, just clean notes, timestamp summaries, clear follow-ups. It didn't feel strategic yet. It felt responsible. Still, something had shifted. For the first time, I wasn't just doing my job. I was observing the system around me, and the system was beginning to show its cracks. After that Thursday, nothing exploded. That's how normalization works. It doesn't arrive as a crisis, it arrives as repetition. The reconciliation gap was eventually adjusted, though not in the way I had recommended. Instead of implementing the formal secondary sign-off control immediately, operations added a temporary review queue. It was informal, manual, easy to bypass. When I asked whether we should document the interim workaround in our compliance log, Daniel replied, "Let's not overcomplicate it. We'll clean it up before year-end." Year-end, in compliance, that phrase is both a promise and a postponement. Over the next few months, similar moments accumulated. Small dismissals, subtle reframing, Conversations where I would raise a procedural risk and someone else would respond with, "We've been doing it this way for years." That sentence always fascinated me. Longevity as proof of safety. I started noticing a pattern in meetings. If I brought up a concern directly, it was often met with polite deflection, but if I shared the same concern privately with Daniel first, and he later introduced it as his own initiative, it was immediately embraced. At first, I told myself this was just hierarchy. Managers filter information, they package it for executive consumption. That's part of leadership, but over time, the distinction blurred. There was a morning when we were reviewing vendor onboarding procedures. I had discovered that 2 vendors had been fast-tracked without full due diligence documentation. Not maliciously, just rushed. I presented the findings calmly, with a proposed corrective action plan. Daniel responded, "Let's not turn this into a federal case. They're low-risk vendors." I remember feeling something tighten behind my ribs. Low risk according to what documentation? I wanted to ask that. Instead, I said, "Understood. I'll note it internally." Later that afternoon, I overheard Daniel on a call with one of the directors. "Yes, we identified a couple of onboarding inconsistencies," he said. "I've already instructed compliance to monitor it." I've already instructed compliance. The phrasing was subtle, but it shifted accountability. The more it happened, the easier it became to rationalize. He's under pressure. Executives don't like bad news. Maybe I am overly cautious. Maybe I'm too rigid. When you're the quiet one in a room of louder personalities, self-doubt can start to sound reasonable. I began softening my language. Instead of saying, "This violates Section 4.2 of the updated compliance policy," I would say, "We may want to revisit this process." Instead of "This creates regulatory exposure," I would say, "There could be some risk here." I thought I was adapting. In reality, I was shrinking my own clarity. What's dangerous about normalized disrespect isn't that it humiliates you. It erodes your calibration. You begin to question your instincts. You begin to assume that the discomfort you feel is simply personality friction. You convince yourself that being technically correct isn't worth being socially inconvenient. But here's what I never stopped doing: documenting every flagged issue, every deferred action, every time a compliance check was postponed until next quarter, every email where timelines shifted, not out of spite, out of consistency. If I were going to be the quiet one, I would at least be the accurate one. I didn't yet realize that accuracy, accumulated over time, becomes leverage. At that stage, I was still trying to belong, still trying to be supportive without being invisible, still believing that patience would eventually be recognized. I didn't know that patience was slowly turning into preparation. There's a moment in every professional dynamic when you realize the role people have quietly assigned you, not the one in your job description, the unspoken one. For me, that realization came during audit preparation season. Audit season changes the temperature of an office. Conversations sharpen, deadlines compress. The same leaders who brushed off minor compliance gaps suddenly become intensely interested in documentation trails. And that's when my value spiked. Not visibly, not ceremoniously, but functionally. Daniel would appear at my desk more frequently. "Can you pull the transaction monitoring logs from Q2? Do we have documentation on that vendor onboarding? Did we ever finalize the reconciliation update?" The answers were always the same. Yes, here. Because I had kept everything, not just the finalized policies, the drafts, the flagged concerns, the timeline notes, the emails confirming that a control hadn't yet been implemented, the reminders I had sent, the responses I had received. I noticed something subtle during those weeks. When documentation was needed, I became indispensable. When decisions were being made, I disappeared again. One afternoon, we were preparing the formal compliance summary that would be presented to the external auditors. Daniel was at the conference table with 2 senior directors. I was asked to sit in for clarification. They discussed how to phrase the reconciliation control delay. "It was a phased implementation," Daniel said smoothly. That wasn't inaccurate, but it wasn't complete either. It had been phased out because operations deprioritized it. I waited for the natural pause. "Just to clarify," I said evenly. The secondary sign-off control was flagged in April and scheduled for implementation in June. It was deferred to Q4 due to resource constraints. The room went quiet for half a second. Daniel nodded. Right. Resource constraints. The directors exchanged a look, not alarmed, just recalibrating. In that instant, I understood my role. I was the factual backbone, the structural integrity beneath the narrative. They expected me to be precise but not political, accurate but not assertive, reliable but not directional, useful but invisible. There's something seductive about being needed but not seen. It gives you access without spotlight, information without scrutiny, and I had access to everything. I saw which compliance checks were skipped during high-volume months. I saw which approvals were retroactively added. I saw which teams treated regulatory requirements as suggestions rather than obligations. I also saw who consistently chose optics over process, but I didn't react. I didn't confront anyone. I simply accepted the role I had been assigned and began to understand its power. Because the person who holds the records holds the timeline. And timelines, when examined carefully, tell stories that charisma cannot override. At that point, I still believed the system would self-correct, that professionalism would prevail. That is when audit day arrived. Everyone would tighten procedures, and we would move forward slightly better than before. I didn't know yet that the coming audit wouldn't just examine processes. It would examine credibility, and someone would need to absorb the impact. The shift didn't happen during a meeting. It didn't happen during a disagreement. It happened on a Tuesday morning at 8:12 a.m. while I was alone at my desk. An email arrived from Daniel with the subject line, Urgent, Auditor Follow-Up. The external audit had officially begun the week before. So far, everything had been routine, document requests, clarifications, standard sampling procedures, but this email felt different. Mia, it read, the auditors identified a material gap in the reconciliation control for Q2 and Q3. They're questioning why compliance cleared the process without full secondary sign-off implementation. I need you to review your documentation immediately. We may need to explain how this was missed. How this was missed. I read the sentence twice, then a third time. There's a specific kind of silence that happens when blame starts forming. It's not loud. It's not accusatory. It's strategic. The wording wasn't aggressive. It was careful, neutral, but it repositioned the gap as something compliance had cleared, as something I had cleared. My pulse didn't spike. I didn't feel anger, not yet. What I felt was clarity. I opened my black leather notebook. April entry. Secondary sign-off control flagged. Email sent. Response minor. Adjust before audit. Follow-up in May. Deferred to Q4. Confirmed by Daniel. Documented. I opened my digital folder. The time-stamped email chain was still there. Screenshots attached. Internal memo drafted but never escalated beyond my manager. Nothing had been missed. It had been deferred. There's a difference. I leaned back in my chair and stared at the skyline outside the glass wall. Cars moved below, unaware of internal corporate politics unfolding 30 floors above them. This was the moment. Not the accusation itself, but the realization that narrative was about to override record. For years, I had rationalized small dismissals, softened language, accepted containment. I had believed that competence would protect me, but competence without visibility can be repurposed. I thought about my options. I could respond defensively, forward the email chain immediately, highlight every instance where I had flagged the issue, protect myself, or I could wait, observe aim, understand exactly how the narrative was being shaped before I introduced facts into it. For the first time, my silence wasn't reflexive. It was deliberate. I drafted a calm reply. Daniel, I'm reviewing the documentation now. I flagged the secondary sign-off gap in April and documented the deferral timeline. I'll compile the relevant records for discussion. No accusation, no emotional charge, just precision. As I hit send, something inside me settled. Not anger, not resentment. Resolve. I understood, suddenly, that I had been playing the role assigned to me, supportive, accurate, contained. But I had never actually examined the power embedded in that role. Documentation is neutral, but timing isn't, and timing, I realized, was now mine to control. That morning, nothing outwardly dramatic occurred. No confrontation, no raised voices, just an email thread quietly expanding. But internally, something irreversible shifted. I stopped trying to be liked and started preparing to be undeniable. After that email, the office atmosphere changed subtly, but perceptibly. Daniel avoided eye contact during our first meeting of the day. Not dramatically, just a slight redirection of gaze when audit questions surfaced. He spoke in broader terms, using phrases like process oversight and team-level review. Team level, another soft redistribution of responsibility. I noticed something else. No one had directly asked to see my documentation yet. That meant the narrative was still forming, and I decided not to interrupt it. There's a difference between silence born of fear and silence chosen with intention. The first shrinks you. The second steadies you. For years, I had been quiet because I didn't want to create friction. Now, I was quiet because I was watching. Over the next 2 days, I observed carefully. In hallway conversations, I overheard fragments. They're focusing heavily on Q2 controls. It's probably just a documentation lag. Compliance should have escalated it. That phrase repeated itself. I checked my records again. I had escalated to Daniel. That was the reporting structure. I had followed protocol precisely. But here's what I realized. Protocol protects organization. Visibility protects individuals. I had done the first. I hadn't secured the second. So I made a decision not reactive, not emotional, but strategic. I would not volunteer my full documentation archive prematurely. If the auditors requested it directly, I would provide everything, cleanly, completely. But I would not rush to correct assumptions before understanding where those assumptions were being positioned. That restraint was new for me. Previously, I would have felt compelled to clarify immediately to ensure no misunderstanding persisted. Accuracy, in my mind, was urgent. Now, I understand that timing accuracy matters just as much as accuracy itself. On Wednesday afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk again. "Have you pulled those records?" he asked casually. "Yes," I said. "Complete timeline, email threads, and control logs." He nodded. "Good. Let's hold off sharing anything until we align messaging." Messaging, not documentation. I met his eyes for a moment longer than usual. "Of course," I replied. And I meant it. I would align messaging with facts. That evening, I stayed late, not out of obligation, but preparation. I organized my files into a structured folder: initial flag pen, manager response, deferred timeline, follow-up reminders, and control implementation date. Everything clean, chronological, undeniable. I didn't feel anxious. I felt steady. Silence, ba'ash, when paired with preparation, becomes power. It forces others to speak more than they intend. It reveals who assumes protection and who verifies it. By Thursday morning, the auditors had scheduled a focused session with compliance. Not management, compliance. Specifically, they requested to speak with the analyst responsible for reconciliation oversight. That was me. When the calendar invite appeared, Daniel forwarded it with a brief message. "We'll handle this together." Together. I looked at my notebook, then at the skyline beyond the glass. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like supporting data. I felt like the primary source, and I understood something clearly. Silence had never been my weakness. It had been my archive building. There's a quiet advantage to being underestimated. People speak more freely around you. They assume you're absorbing tasks, not patterns. For years, while I sat at the edge of conference tables and took notes, no one asked to see. I was doing more than recording action items. I was mapping behavior. Who deferred controls during high-revenue quarters? Who requested temporary exceptions? Who consistently used the phrase, "We'll clean it up later"? At first, my documentation was procedural, strictly compliance-focused. But over time, I began noticing repetition in decision-making logic. The same trade-offs, the same shortcuts, the same justifications. And without consciously planning it, I started organizing my records in a way that made those patterns visible. I created cross-reference sheets, not official documents, personal ones. A simple matrix linking flagged issues to resolution timelines. Notes about when recommendations were implemented versus when they were postponed. Email confirmations are attached to each entry. Not dramatic, not obsessive, structured. If someone had opened my folders, they would have seen nothing alarming, just thoroughness. But thoroughness, when aggregated over years, becomes context, and context changes everything. The auditor's request to meet directly with me didn't surprise me. External reviewers have a different instinct than internal leadership. They don't evaluate comfort. They evaluate traceability. I prepared for that meeting the same way I prepared for every audit session, except this time. I wasn't just bringing the polished compliance binder. I was bringing chronology. On the morning of the session, I arrived early at the small glass conference room. My laptop was open. My notebook is beside it, tabs marked with discrete color codes. Daniel walked in 5 minutes later, composed but slightly tight around the jaw. "Let's keep answers concise," he said quietly. "No need to overwhelm them with detail." Overwhelm. Detail. The irony didn't escape me. The auditors entered 2 of them. Calm, professional, neutral. After introductions, one of them began reviewing the reconciliation control gap. "We understand there was a delay in implementing secondary sign-off for high-value transfers in Q2 and Q3. She said, "Can you walk us through the timeline?" She looked at me directly, not at Daniel, at me, and in that moment something clarified. For years, I had been compressing my language to fit the room's tolerance. Now, the room's tolerance was precise. "Yes," I said evenly. The gap was first identified on April 12th during an internal review. I flagged it the same day and recommended immediate implementation. The decision was made to defer due to operational constraints, with an anticipated rollout in Q4. Follow-up reminders were sent in May and July. Implementation occurred on October 3rd. No emotion, no accusation, just dates. The auditor nodded. "Do you have documentation of those communications?" "I do." I turned my laptop toward her and opened the folder. Email threads, time-stamped, attached policy references. My original memo highlighted risk exposure. Daniel remained silent. The room shifted not dramatically, but perceptibly. When facts are introduced cleanly, they don't create chaos. They create recalibration. The second auditor leaned forward slightly. "Just to clarify, compliance did not clear the control during Q2. I held his gaze. Compliance flagged the absence of the control and documented the deferral decision. We did not mark the control as implemented until October. There it was. Not confrontation. Correction. I didn't look at Daniel. I didn't need to. What they never noticed, what no one had noticed, was that I had never stopped protecting the organization. I had simply started protecting the record of how decisions were made. After the meeting, the auditors thanked me for the clarity. Clarity. A word I hadn't heard in performance reviews. Daniel walked beside me back to the main floor in silence. He wasn't angry. He wasn't apologetic. He was calculating. And I understood something in that elevator ride. The power shift had already begun, not because I exposed anyone, but because I stopped compressing the truth. After the audit session, nothing outwardly dramatic happened. No one was escorted out. No emergency executive meetings were announced. The office continued humming with the same fluorescent-lit normalcy it always had. But under that surface, I could feel recalibration. 2 days later, I received a separate calendar invitation, this time directly from the lead auditor. No Daniel CC'd. No management copied. Subject line follow-up clarification, reconciliation controls. The meeting was virtual, just the auditor and me. Her tone was the same as before, measured. Professional? "I want to ensure we fully understand the decision-making chain," she began. "Your documentation was clear, but I need confirmation when the control was deferred. Who formally approved that deferral?" That question wasn't about process anymore. It was about accountability. I paused not because I didn't know the answer, but because I understood the weight of naming it. "In our structure," I said carefully, "control implementation timelines are approved by the compliance manager in coordination with operations leadership. And in this instance, the deferral acknowledgement came from my manager, Daniel. I didn't add commentary. I didn't interpret intent. I simply described the structure." There was a brief silence as she typed notes. "Thank you," she said. "Your records are consistent. That's helpful." Consistent. I ended the call and sat still for a moment. That was the private reveal. Not public, not explosive, but clear. The narrative that had begun forming that compliance had missed the control gap was dissolving quietly. In its place was a documented chain of decisions. And I realized something almost unsettling. I hadn't needed to defend myself aggressively. I hadn't needed to confront anyone. The structure of my documentation had done the work for me. For years, I had thought my value lay in preventing problems. But in that moment, I saw a deeper truth. My value was traceability, the ability to reconstruct reality without distortion. Later that afternoon, Daniel stopped by my desk again. "I heard you had a follow-up call," he said, tone neutral. "Yes. What did they ask?" "Clarification on approval timelines." He nodded slowly, and I provided documentation. A small pause. "Good," he said. "That's good." But his voice carried something new, not authority, not irritation, awareness. He understood now that the record was independent of narrative, that my notes weren't casual reminders. They were structural memory, and structural memory doesn't bend easily. That evening, I reviewed my broader archive not anxiously, but thoughtfully. The reconciliation control wasn't the only deferred safeguard. There were other instances where implementation timelines shifted under pressure, other places where temporary workarounds stretched longer than intended, all documented, all time-stamped. For the first time, I asked myself a question I hadn't allowed before. If asked directly, how much clarity was I willing to provide? Because clarity has layers. There's the minimum necessary, and then there's complete. I wasn't angry. I wasn't seeking retribution, but I was done absorbing misalignment quietly. The private reveal wasn't that Daniel had approved a deferral. It was then that I no longer felt obligated to protect narratives that contradicted documented truth. I closed my notebook and slid it into my bag. Not as a shield, as a decision waiting to be made. The real decision wasn't whether to tell the truth. That part was easy. The decision was about the degree. In corporate environments, information flows in gradients. You can answer the question asked narrowly, precisely, and stop there. Or you can widen the frame. You can offer context that wasn't explicitly requested, but is structurally relevant. Both are honest. Only one is irreversible. The week after my follow-up call, the auditors expanded their scope. It was subtle, a few additional document requests, a broader sampling window, more detailed inquiries about control implementation timelines across departments. Patterns were beginning to matter. Daniel's tone shifted in meetings. He was careful now, measured. He included me more frequently in executive briefings, as if proximity might imply shared ownership rather than delegated responsibility. "Mia's been instrumental in tracking these controls," he said once, almost casually. Instrumental? The word lingered. For years, I had been supporting. Now I was instrumental. Not because my behavior changed, but because visibility did. That afternoon, I reviewed a fresh request from the auditors. Provide documentation of all deferred compliance controls over the past fiscal year, including approval chain and implementation status. All deferred controls, not just reconciliation. I stared at the screen for a long moment. I had that documentation, organized, cross-referenced, time-stamped. If I provided only the minimum, only the specific control they were currently examining, the audit might remain contained. It would identify a gap, issue a recommendation, and move on. If I provided the full deferred control matrix, the scope would widen. Decision patterns would become visible. Approval chains would be examined more closely. It wouldn't destroy the company. There was no fraud, no criminal activity, but it would shift accountability upward. I thought about loyalty to a manager who had subtly positioned compliance as the oversight point, loyalty to a company that often prioritized optics over process. And then I thought about something simpler. Professional integrity isn't selective. It doesn't expand or contract based on comfort. That evening, I stayed late again. The office was quiet, lights dimmed in unused conference rooms. I opened my master spreadsheet, the one no one had ever asked to see in full. Each row represented a deferred control. Original flag date, risk level. Deferral rationale, approval acknowledgement, actual implementation date. Clean, neutral, complete. I hovered over the attach button for a long moment. This was the irreversible choice. Not dramatic, not explosive. But once the full matrix entered the audit record, the narrative could no longer narrow the issue to a minor oversight. It would become a pattern of prioritization decisions. I attached the file. In the email body, I wrote, "Per your request, please find attached documentation of all deferred compliance controls during the fiscal year, including approval chains and implementation timelines. Let me know if additional clarification is needed. No commentary, no interpretation, just structure. I hit send, and in that quiet, nearly empty office, I felt something settle inside me. Not triumph, alignment. For the first time, my silence and my clarity were working together. Whatever followed would not be reactionary. It would be traceable. The email left my outbox at 7:42 p.m. By 8:03 p.m., I received a simple acknowledgement from the audit team. Received, thank you. Nothing else. No immediate escalation, no dramatic reaction. That's the thing about structural shifts, they don't announce themselves. They begin quietly, inside review rooms you're not in. The next morning, the office felt almost unchanged. Daniel was at his desk earlier than usual. His door, that has to typically half open, was fully closed. Meetings appeared on his calendar in blocks labeled internal alignment. No one mentioned my attachment. No one needed to. Throughout the day, additional document requests came through this time, routed formally through audit channels rather than casually through Daniel. The language was precise. Please provide evidence of executive review on deferred high-risk controls. Clarify rationale for postponement of vendor due diligence in Q3. Confirm notification chain for control delay exceeding 90 days. The scope had widened, not catastrophically, but undeniably. I answered each request the same way I always had, cleanly, chronologically, without commentary. I did not forward emails unnecessarily. I did not CC executives. I did not signal urgency. I simply responded. That was the strategy. No sudden movements. No emotional undertones. Just consistency. By midweek, something subtle began happening. Operations started implementing small corrective actions without waiting for formal audit recommendations. Secondary sign-offs were being added. Vendor files were updated. Documentation logs refreshed. It was as if the organization had quietly recognized that the spotlight was no longer diffuse. It was focused, and focused light changes behavior. Daniel stopped framing conversations in terms of minor gaps. Now he spoke about process enhancements and strengthening governance. Language adjusts quickly when accountability becomes visible. On Thursday afternoon, he called me into his office. He didn't close the door this time. We're going to need to present a consolidated response to the audit committee, he said evenly. I'd like you to help draft it. Help draft it? I met his gaze calmly. Of course. What I didn't say was that I already had most of it written in fragments, across years of documentation. He continued. This isn't about blame. It's about showing we're proactive. I nodded, because he was right. It wasn't about blame anymore. That opportunity had passed the moment the full matrix entered the audit record. Now it was about credibility. And credibility depends on coherence between past decisions and present corrections. Over the next few days, I worked late again, but this time, not alone. Daniel asked for my input regularly. He requested my timeline summaries. He deferred to my phrasing when describing control evolution, not dramatically, not publicly, but noticeably. The power dynamic hadn't flipped. It had recalibrated. And the most interesting part, I hadn't raised my voice once. I hadn't accused anyone. I hadn't defended myself aggressively. I had simply allowed the record to exist fully. Moving in silence doesn't mean moving secretly. It means moving without theatrics. By the end of the week, the consequences were no longer theoretical. They were procedural, and procedures, once adjusted, don't easily revert. Consequences in corporate environments rarely arrive with spectacle. They arrive as meetings, closed doors, adjusted reporting lines, language that sounds neutral, but carries weight. The first visible shift happened 2 weeks after I sent the full deferred control matrix. An email from the chief risk officer landed in everyone's inbox. Effective immediately. All deferred compliance controls exceeding 60 days require executive-level review and documented approval. Quarterly summaries will be presented directly to the audit committee. Directly, not filtered, not summarized, structured. It wasn't framed as a corrective action from a failure. It was described as an enhancement to governance oversight. But everyone understood what had triggered it. I watched the office absorb the change in small ways. Operations began requesting my sign-off earlier in their project timelines instead of after implementation. Vendor onboarding slowed slightly, not dramatically, just enough to reflect actual due diligence. Email phrasing shifted from "can we bypass this temporarily" to "what's the documented process for exception approval?" Language reveals learning. Daniel's behavior changed too. He became more cautious in meetings. When discussing timelines, he would glance at me before confirming them publicly. Not for approval, but for verification. It was subtle, but the dynamic had shifted from assumption to confirmation. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the break room. "They're cracking down because of the audit." Someone said, "Yeah," another replied. "Compliance has been keeping pretty detailed records." There was no resentment in their voices, just acknowledgement. For years, my documentation had been background noise. Now it was structural awareness. But consequences don't only affect the process, they affect perception. During a quarterly town hall, the CEO briefly referenced the audit. "We've identified areas where our internal escalation protocols can be strengthened," she said. "I want to thank the compliance team for their thorough documentation, which allowed us to address these proactively." The compliance team, plural. I felt a small, unexpected warmth in my chest. Not pride exactly, recognition, not spotlight, but legitimacy. After the meeting, Daniel stopped by my desk. "That went well?" he said. "Yes," I replied. He hesitated for a moment. "You handled the audit discussions professionally," he added. "I appreciate that." Professionally. Again, no apology. No explicit acknowledgement of how the narrative had initially leaned. But something in his tone carried quiet recalibration. The consequences weren't punitive. No one was demoted. No public reprimands occurred. Instead, responsibility redistributed itself upward. Approval chains tightened. Executive oversight increased. Decision rationales were documented more carefully. And perhaps most importantly, the assumption that compliance would absorb ambiguity disappeared. I wasn't invisible anymore, not because I demanded visibility, but because I allowed the record to speak completely. Consequences, when rooted in structure rather than emotion, feel different. They don't humiliate. They reorganize. And reorganization, once implemented, rarely reverses itself. By the time leadership fully understood the depth of the audit's findings, the narrative had already crystallized, not as a scandal, not as a catastrophe, but as a pattern. The audit committee meeting happened on a Monday morning. I wasn't in the room I didn't need to be. My documentation was. The deferred control matrix had been incorporated into the official presentation deck. Each instance is summarized. Approval chains outlined. Implementation lags are charted across quarters. When you lay data out chronologically, it stops being anecdotal. It becomes behavioral. Later that afternoon, Daniel called me into his office again. This time, the door was closed. His posture was different, not defensive, not irritated, measured. "The committee has requested a formal remediation plan," he said. "They're particularly concerned about the repeated deferrals exceeding 90 days. I nodded. "That makes sense." He studied me for a moment. "I want to be clear," he added carefully. "This isn't being framed as a compliance failure." There it was again, framing. I met his gaze evenly. "The documentation reflects that compliance flagged each gap at the time." "Yes," he said quickly. "It does." Silence settled between us. For the first time, there was no subtle attempt to reposition responsibility. No suggestion that something had been missed. The record had settled that question. "I should have escalated some of those decisions further," he said quietly. It wasn't a full apology. It wasn't dramatic, but it was the closest acknowledgement yet. I didn't respond with validation or reproach. I followed the reporting structure in place. I said simply, and that was the truth. The most striking part of this phase wasn't confrontation. It was finality. Once the audit committee had reviewed the complete pattern, there was no way to narrow the issue back to a minor oversight. No way to quietly reclassify deferrals as administrative delays. Executive-level oversight was now mandatory. Quarterly reporting structures had changed. Documentation standards were formalized. The system had adjusted. And systems don't easily revert once formal governance is rewritten. In the weeks that followed, I noticed something else. Daniel was more careful not just with me, but with everyone. Decisions that previously would have been made informally were now documented. Risk conversations were no longer minimized. "We'll clean it up later," disappeared from his vocabulary. Too late to fix it doesn't mean too late to improve. It means too late to pretend it wasn't happening. One evening, as I packed my bag to leave, I caught my reflection faintly in the darkened window. I didn't look different, but I felt recalibrated, not triumphant, not vindicated, just aligned. The attempt, subtle as it was, to let compliance absorb the audit gap had dissolved under the weight of structure. Not because I fought it, but because I let it unfold fully. And once truth is documented thoroughly enough, there's a point where even intention can't bend it back. That point had passed. The conversation happened on a Friday afternoon. Not during a crisis, not after an explosive meeting. Just at the end of a long week. Daniel asked if I had a few minutes. His office door was open, the late sun cutting across the floor in long, quiet lines. The atmosphere wasn't tense, it was reflective. "I've been thinking," he began, folding his hands on the desk, "about how this unfolded." I waited. When the auditors first raised the reconciliation gap, I defaulted to assuming it was a documentation lapse. He said, "That wasn't fair." There was no drama in his voice, no defensiveness, just recognition. "I understand why you'd want clarity quickly," I replied. My tone was steady, neutral. He nodded. "I should have reviewed your notes before suggesting it might have been missed." There it was. Not an apology wrapped in emotion, an acknowledgement wrapped in accuracy. For years, I would have rushed to soften this moment to reassure him, to deflect tension. I might have said, "It's fine," or "It worked out." But this time, I didn't dilute it. I flagged the control gap when I saw it. I said calmly, "I escalated according to our structure. That's what I'm responsible for." He absorbed that. "Yes," he said quietly. "You did." Silence settled between us again, not uncomfortable, just honest. "I underestimated how critical your documentation process is," he added after a moment. "And I probably underestimated how much you were carrying. Probably I allowed myself a small, almost imperceptible exhale. I've always tried to be thorough." I said, "That's the job." He gave a short nod. "It is. And we'll adjust how we handle escalation going forward. I don't want you in a position where responsibility is ambiguous." Ambiguity, that was the word. Not blame, not fault. Ambiguity, that would be helpful, I replied. No raised voices, no accusations, no emotional unloading. Just clarity aligning with acknowledgement. As I stood to leave, he added one more sentence. "You handled this with professionalism." Professionalism? For the first time, the word didn't feel like a containment strategy. It felt accurate. I walked back to my desk without adrenaline, without triumph. There was no internal victory speech playing in my head, just quiet equilibrium. Confrontation without heat is powerful because it leaves no residue, no humiliation, no defensiveness, no retaliation, just an adjustment. An adjustment is sustainable. That conversation didn't rewrite the past. It didn't erase the months of subtle dismissal, but it did something more durable. It reset the baseline. From that day forward, I thought my documentation wasn't treated as excessive. It was treated as essential. And I no longer felt the need to compress myself to make others comfortable. The truth had already done its work. If you asked me what changed after the audit, I wouldn't point to a promotion. I didn't suddenly become louder in meetings. I didn't start interrupting people mid-sentence. I didn't reinvent myself into a different personality. What changed was internal alignment. For years, I believed quiet competence would eventually speak for itself. And it did, but only after I stopped softening it to fit other people's comfort. Today, when I walk into meetings, I still sit in the same seat. Laptop open, notebook beside it, but I don't compress my language anymore. If a control is missing, I say, the control's not implemented. If a risk exists, I say, this creates exposure under Section 4.2. If a timeline is unrealistic, I say, that deadline requires executive approval, not confrontational, not sharp, just precise. And precision, delivered calmly, carries weight. The biggest shift isn't how others treat me. It's how I treat my own clarity. I no longer reinterpret discomfort as overreaction. I no longer downgrade my assessments to make them more palatable. I no longer assume that being agreeable is safer than being accurate. There's something powerful about realizing that you don't need to dominate a room to anchor it. You just need consistency. The audit didn't make me more assertive. It made me more integrated. My silence is still there, but now it's deliberate. When I choose not to speak, it's because the moment doesn't require it, not because I'm minimizing myself. Daniel and I work differently now. There's more transparency and escalation, Fewer will clean it up later conversations. When he references a compliance position in executive settings, he cites the source directly. That change was enforced. It was earned through structure. And perhaps most importantly, I don't carry resentment. Resentment would imply that I was wronged in a way that diminished me. But I wasn't diminished. I was underestimated. And underestimation, handled patiently, can become leverage. I still keep my records. Still timestamp notes. Still map timelines. Not because I expect conflict, but because clarity is my standard. Who I am now isn't louder. It's steadier. I don't need to prove my value through reaction. I've learned that when your documentation aligns with your integrity, you don't need theatrics. You just need time. And time, when paired with consistency, eventually reveals exactly where responsibility belongs. When people hear stories about workplace conflict, they often expect a dramatic ending, a public exposure, a resignation letter, a visible victory. But most real shifts don't look like that. They look like policy updates, rewritten escalation paths, a meeting where your voice is no longer bypassed. What happened in my story wasn't revenge. It was recalibration. My manager blamed me for the audit failure, at least initially. The language suggested something had been missed. But when the auditor asked for my notes, something simple and irreversible happened. The record spoke, and my documentation exposed who skipped compliance checks, not because I set out to expose anyone, but because I had never stopped documenting reality as it happened. There's a difference between being quiet and being passive. For years, I thought the two were interchangeable. I thought silence meant accommodation, that patience meant endurance. But I learned that silence can also be preparation, that calm can be leveraged, that truth, when structured carefully, doesn't need amplification. It just needs to be complete. If you're someone who tends to carry responsibility quietly, if you're the person who notices gaps before others do, if you've ever felt your precision was treated as overthinking, I want you to remember this. Clarity is not aggression. Documentation is not distrust. And integrity does not need to shout to be powerful. Sometimes the strongest move you can make is simply allowing the full record to exist. Because when accountability eventually arrives, and it always does, the person who kept the timeline steady doesn't need to defend themselves. They just need to open the file. I'm curious, have you ever been in a situation where staying calm and consistent protected you more than reacting ever could?
Video của mình hôm nay đến đây là kết thúc. Nếu bạn thích video này, hãy cho mình xin một lượt like và một lượt đăng ký kênh. Hẹn gặp lại các bạn ở trong những video tiếp theo. Bye bye!